Okay, chapter 19. That's a really great chapter. Population ecology is really neat because it has so many things that actually affect us. So, population ecology. Now, first of all, there are some parameters that we have to figure out when it comes to population. Parameters meaning that what is a population? And so some key parameters are things like how many are there? Over what area do we find them? What is their density? And so density is one of the key things that defines populations, and especially at what density can these populations occur, what's the minimum, what's the maximum, and so on. And all you have to do here is take the number of individuals and divide by the area. So it would be the number of individuals per square kilometer, per hectare. And that's in international scientific units. Or perhaps if you want to, per acre or something like that. But what a critical thing about this is the number of individuals. Because when you're trying to study a natural population, the number isn't written anywhere. If you're going out to figure out how many desert tortoises are there around Victorville, how are you going to do that, right? So it's not so easy to figure out. You cannot possibly count all the organisms in a population unless the population is really, really confined to a certain area and there's very few individuals. And so this becomes a problem. In fact, we can never really reliably count the number of individuals in natural populations at all. We always have to deal with estimates. Now, when it comes to the number of individuals, we as humans, we also deal with this. It's written in the Constitution, in fact, that every 10 years we're going to have a census. Because the census is going to set certain parameters for our democracy, right? This is one of the key things. And so we know intuitively that numbers are very important. In this case, it's important because we can actually try to figure out what the density of a population is as one of the key features of that population. And so area, of course, is one thing. If you're looking at something in a water column, you could also go with volume, so it would be per cubic meter, per liter of water, and so on. But the estimates are important. If you can't count the individual organisms, you have to come up with some way to produce an estimate. Now, I can have you all sit down and sit still and count you, but if you were, a bunch of little fruit flies in a jar, that would be a lot harder. I'd have to remove each one to make sure I count them all. But now, if I'm looking at an entire room full of fruit flies, that's not going to happen. So what I can do is I can take a subset of that area, I can take some random bits of that area, and I can then count those, which may be more manageable, and from that I can extrapolate the whole population. There are all kinds of approaches to doing this with prairie dogs and with birds and with so on, with all kinds of other things. But estimates are actually very popular. Question?
So this is, I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but it's like when you buy fish and you have them in a tank and they tell you can only have so many in the tank because of the size of the tank. Is that how they do it?
Yes.
Like they measure the water and then the size of the fish?
Well, they tell you what the diameter, what the numbers are that define the tank, height, width, and length. And so you can calculate the volume of the tank. And the reason why this becomes important is because if you have too great of a density of any particular organisms, they will interact and it may be a problem. We'll get to that in a minute. I'll explain to you exactly what happens then. Another way you can look at populations by identifying their dispersion patterns. How are they distributed throughout this environment? So if you have an area, if you have a volume, are they all in one place, or are they just anywhere, or what's the dispersion pattern? And so when you're looking at this, you're going to find that in many cases the dispersion is clumped. And it is clumped because it is directly linked to the resources available in the environment. You'll find that in most places, the resources are not equally distributed throughout the environment, which means that the resources themselves exist in some places and not in another. If you look at an area, you find that perhaps there's a river running through it. Well, the river, that's water, that's a resource, and it is in a essentially two-dimensional part of that habitat. So there are going to be a lot of things going on right near that river because a lot of organisms will need the water. Or perhaps you'll find that the habitat, the soils in the habitat are distributed in a patchy way. There's more phosphate in that area of the soil than over here. Well, if you're a phosphate-needing organism, then you need to live where the phosphate is. And so that will clump your distribution. There are also things called uniform, and this is entirely due to behavior. Uniform dispersion means that organisms choose to space themselves out. You'll find this in a lot of seabird colonies. When they nest, they put their nests together. A lot of them are actually spreading themselves out. Penguins, you'll find in penguin colonies when the males have the egg and they're sort of hanging out waiting for the egg to hatch. Well, they're within pecking distance. So if you are a penguin and you're trying to work your way through this group of other penguins, they're gonna sort of peck at you and say, "Don't stay here because you're too close. Find your own place." Yep. And so these are the kind of things that you would call uniform. But then there are some places where the dispersion pattern is truly random, and that means that the resources are equally distributed. Equal distribution of resources. And this is the kind of thing that you'll find in something like a tropical rainforest. There's a lot of rainfall, the soil is pretty uniform wherever you go, and so as a consequence, if you're a tree, it doesn't really matter exactly where you grow. You can grow with some trees that are the same, you can really be spread throughout the forest, and you find that there's no real rhyme or reason for how trees are distributed in rainforests. So that would be random. Now, some of the key aspects of populations, once we understand them a little bit more, we can try and figure out what is the age structure within a population. And so we use something called age structure. Age structure diagrams. And age structure diagrams are really great because they give you, as an example, the history of the population. So if you know how many organisms at any given age there are in the population, then you can tell if the population was doing well a few years ago or not. So if, let's say, that the maximum longevity of a certain species of bird, this is an example in the book, is 10 years, and there are none that are 11, none that are 12, none that are 13 years old, well then you know that 10 is where it's at, right? And then if you look at how many in the population are age 10, how many 9, how many 4, how many 3, and so on, and there are gaps somewhere, then the question is, well, why aren't there any that are 4 years old? Well, something must have happened 4 years ago that did not allow any recruitment. The baby birds must have all died, or they must have moved or something. So even though we may not know exactly what happened, if we do see these anomalies, at least we know where to look and perhaps what to look for. They are also useful because they can help estimate the future. Now, estimating the future is always a little iffy because you think nobody can really see into the future, but we can to some extent. Because you were sitting here, if you're 22 years old today, in a year you're going to be 23. If you survive, right, then that means you're going to be a year older. And the year after that, you're going to be 26, or however many. 4 years after, you're going to be 26, and then 4 years after that, you're going to be 30, and so on. So there is a certain amount of predictability, especially in organisms whose environment is relatively stable and who live in relatively stable conditions overall. And so to look into the future is just a matter of going from where you are today in this population to the next step. The oldest ones are going to die, the youngest ones are going to be recruited, but you don't know exactly how many they're going to be. And that's why in some cases, in the case of humans for example, sometimes you have these bulges. We have a big bulge in our population. In the YouTube lecture I go into that, and that's baby boomers, right? And so the baby boomers, they have this bulge in the population, and it moves older and older and older. So it's predictable to figure out that eventually they're going to be non-productive in terms of the workforce, or less productive, as they move into retirement. And then what are we going to do? Well, that coincides with them being of the age where they need to have perhaps more medical attention. So what are we going to do about that? Now, this problem is not new, because these baby boomers have been aging for 40 years. But nobody has actually been thinking about it, because no politician will ever look at an age structure diagram. They're not biologists. But yet it is very informative just to look at an age structure diagram to maybe figure out what's going on. It also helps us explain or determine whether a population is a rapid growth population, which is a triangular, a pyramid shape population, versus slow growth, which is a more rectangular kind of growth. And you'll find that populations can shift. And so our population has shifted from something like this in the early part of the 1900s, where we were primarily an agricultural society, essentially something where places like African economies might find themselves now. They're pretty much in this position here. And we've now moved into slow growth, which is where you find a lot of the European economies as well. So rapid growth versus slow growth. And all these kind of things you can read from age structure diagrams. So it's very useful to take a look at those. As part of this calculation of age structure diagrams, we also can create something called life tables. And life tables tell you something about the probability of survivorship in a population. So if you are of a given age today, you know that, based on statistics, in the United States you have a life expectancy which will take you to X, Y, or Z. So if you're female, it's a little bit more than if you're male, but still pretty good. I think we're almost hitting 80 years now. In some European countries, it's well into the 80s. So life tables give us an idea of our survivorship. Now, of course, survivorship not only in the human population, but also in terms of any other kind of organismal population. And there are three types. Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3 survivorship. And if you actually were to put these on a graph, where you have the lifespan, and over here is 100% of the lifespan, and on the side, lifespan, you're going to have survival. Our population is like this. We are born, we survive, we survive, we survive. And then at some point, when we get relatively close to our maximum possible lifespan, then the curve starts to go down rather rapidly. And nobody survives past the maximum lifespan. That's just the way it is. And so this is what you'll find in a human and in a large, generally a large mammal type of curve, and that's the type 1. Then you also have something called type 2, which is different because in a type 2 curve, the chance of dying is essentially constant throughout the organism's life. Small mammals, amphibians, reptiles, you find that those tend to be in a type 2 survivorship curve. And then lastly, you have some organisms where their survival early in life is highly questionable. But once they get going, once they become established, once they reach a certain age, perhaps a certain size, then it's going to be pretty long. And so this is the type 3 survivorship curve. Now, when it comes to lifespan, it doesn't mean 100 years. It's 100%. Think about mayflies. Mayflies live a day. I mean, they do have a larval stage and so on that lives a little bit longer, but as adults, they'll live a day. And most of them die right when they emerge. When mayflies emerge along rivers, lakes, and ponds, there's a feeding frenzy by the neighboring fish and insects. And literally, most of the mayflies are going to emerge. They're particularly vulnerable right when the wings dry and when they literally take off. They take off across the water surface. They're relatively low on the water, and the fish will come and get them, just like that. But once they get going, once they're up and around, and they can congregate and so on, then they will actually be able to live out their single day. So once they get past a certain point, then yeah, they'll do pretty well, and they'll reproduce and all that kind of stuff. There are, of course, other organisms, oysters, in terms of longevity. Baby oysters are fish food, but once they settle down and once they become established, then they can live to 80, 90, 100 years, some of them. So those are what we can get from life tables. Now, as part of being an organism, you can display a variety of life history strategies. What's going to be best for you? Well, in some cases, maybe an opportunistic life history is the best. An opportunistic life history means that you mature very rapidly, so that means you reach sexual maturity very quickly, and you produce lots of offspring. An opportunistic lifestyle is one that could prompt the reproductive episode when the weather changes. Now you find this kind of lifestyle with the wildflowers. We've had a bumper crop of wildflowers this year, and it was because it just rained a lot. So we had a lot of water that came in, the water brought things past a certain threshold, and then boom, we had these enormous blooms of wildflowers, desert wildflowers, because these are opportunistic. And so this kind of thing is a little bit like throwing mud against the wall. If you just throw a lot and the mud's pretty good, then more of it will stick. And so if you produce a lot of offspring, then the chances that more will survive than if you didn't. The opposite of this, kind of on a continuum, the opposite end, would be called equilibrial life history strategy. And for that, you're going to have slow maturation, few offspring, and in many instances, parental care. So slow maturation means that the organism takes time to establish itself, takes time to bring in some substance in terms of body mass, in terms of ability to withstand changes in the environment, and so on, so that the parental organism itself is going to be really ready to deal with the environment. They'll produce few offspring, and they'll take care of them, because that's a hedge against just putting all this energy out for offspring and not seeing them to success. So it's the opposite of what happens in opportunistic lifestyle, where basically, I don't care how much energy it takes. In fact, I'll put all my energy into this one basket, but there are going to be 10,000 eggs in there. And then I'll die. That's opportunistic. Now, there are all kinds of things in between. So there are opportunistic and equilibrial on the extremes, and then there's various levels in between, where there's perhaps less parental care and so on. And then one of the key things with which to define what populations are, sort of one of the last things is population growth. Now, population growth also has extremes. You'll find that there tend to be two types of growth. One of those is exponential, and the other one is logistic. Exponential versus logistic growth. Now, if you were to do something, do an experiment and say, okay, what do these mean? Then you can once again look at a graph. And if you're going to have exponential growth, that means the organisms start to grow and start to grow and start to grow, and that there really is an exponential growth. Now, it turns out that this really isn't something that can happen indefinitely, because at some point the organism is going to encounter some environmental feature that's going to slow their growth down. I mean, if there were no environmental features that would influence the growth of a population, then the human population or the insect population or the bacterial population would have covered the earth several times over. But there always are things that occur. And when these things occur, then you find that the exponential growth turns into logistic growth. So the red line is logistic growth. And what it means is that at some point during the early growth of the population, which can still be exponential, something happens that turns it. Some environmental feature gets in the way, and so then exponential growth turns into logistic growth. And the logistic growth curve will tend to level out at a population size called the carrying capacity. Even the human population is, so it appears, headed that way. And nobody knows exactly what the turning point was. I have my own ideas about this. I think it has to do with being more closely connected with all other humans. If you're disconnected, you don't know each other, you don't see each other, then you don't care. But now that you know there's environmental problems in India, and there's strife in this country, and there's overcrowding in that country, and there's pollution in this place, then you have sort of a growing consciousness over what's enough. And since we have a 24/7 news cycle and information literally is at our fingertips, then people just start to realize that, gosh, maybe I shouldn't have 10 kids. Maybe 2 or 3 is enough. Not only in terms of what I see in terms of overcrowding, but also how other people with 12 kids or 10 kids struggle economically. So there are just some things that we see now that we never saw before. Now, there are some key factors that limit the population growth. So some of these include density. So there's something called density-dependent factors that limit population growth. Density-dependent, those are always biotic because they depend on other organisms in your group. Now, what are these? Well, if you think about stress, stress is one of the key things. Just encountering more neighbors. More neighbors make more waste, which means the environment isn't as nice anymore. You have too many neighbors with whom to share the place. This is perhaps going to limit your food source. And so there are a variety of things that have to do with density. Then there are also density independent. Density independent factors, which are primarily abiotic. And these will include things like sudden temperature changes. So temperature shock could be one of the key things that's a density independent factor. Or perhaps it's a lack of water or nutrients. Environmentally produced lack of water nutrients. Not because there are organisms that are eating the stuff, but because the tree isn't growing because it's too dry and the tree is your food source. So that, in that case, density independent. And it turns out that sometimes populations even cycle. Population cycles. In the lectures, I have the boom and bust cycle, for example. And then lastly, I just want to mention a couple of the case studies that you should review. Case studies. And these include, there's the story of the woodpecker. There is something called kudzu, and then there is one with cod, and so then there's the, there are a variety of case studies that I give you as part of this. So you'll have those as well. Okay, so that's population ecology, chapter 19.